Alright, so we're going to talk about some different types of synthesis. The first thing I want to approach is that whether or not that you have an expensive DAW or a cheap DAW, or you got Audacity if you got no money, that I suggest that you take a song, create a song, and put in the song harmonics, like fundamental. If you watch the video that I did on harmonics and timbres, there should have been a video on that in there that I showed you. And you want to create one that's fundamental all the way through the 16th harmonic. That's to experiment with building harmonics. And you can put a tone generator, some type of a tone generator, that's going to, create a tone at a certain frequency. And if you've watched that video I showed you on harmonics, that should make sense. That you're going to create for different frequencies to create different, to make different timbres. And that's a really cool thing to do, because then you can put a tone generator on each one of those, and you can add and subtract different, frequencies and harmonic content to create harmonics, in just a very basic way to help you to understand how to be building harmonics with different frequencies and different volume levels, different decibel levels. And something like some type of a tremolo effect, on each one of those, or on a bus at the end of that, and some type of thing that does frequency modulation, so that while you're looking through those, that you can create harmonics that way to experiment around with them. You have something to do, some type of tremolo in the decibel, some kind of modulation in volumes, and modulation in frequency. And sometimes you can even automate the frequency of the tone generator from something like that, from a volume modulation plugin, to create that kind of stuff. And that can get a little complex, but the basic understanding is to be able to create those harmonics so you can sit there and build some waveforms inside of a song. So that's a real cool thing. The other thing that I do suggest is that there is a free synthesizer called Add Sub FX, and it's free to download. And basically, it's got a lot of the basic parameters: additive synthesis, subtractive synthesis, and pad synthesis, that you can go through, and it'll show you all the different parameters that you can adjust inside the synthesizer to create sound. And the whole thing is set up to where you can get right down to the sinusoids and start out with basic functions and then create them from there. And subtractive synthesis, that we'll be talking about, being able to go in there and actually use a subtractive synthesizer on them. That's a free program to experiment around with, to get a basic understanding of the things that you're dealing with, as far as while you're synthesizing, what type of synthesis you might be doing. So I suggest those two things to help you explore the harmonics and different things you can do, because in both of those applications of this and that synthesizer, real basically, there's lots of synthesizers out there, so I'm not getting into that, but to understand the basics, and to be able to build some sound. In this kind of environment, you can create the sound any way you want, and you can use any type of plug-in, anything that you have that, to actually help mold and shape the sound, and you can actually use that song as a synthesizer to experiment. So that's one recommendation as we get started. So, let's go ahead and start looking at the different types of synthesis. Alright, the first type of synthesis we'd be looking at would be subtractive synthesis. Basically, it's kind of self-descriptive, is that you want to subtract properties of a sound. So, that's a real basic understanding of what that means. But what it's trying to, relate is that it's a method of sound synthesis in which partials of an audio signal, often one rich in harmonics, are attenuated by a filter to alter the timbre of the sound. So, a real quick understanding of that is we've got any sound. And, I really hope that you've watched those videos so you have some understanding of sound. It's very much directly related to understanding these things. So, you have a timbre that is, a bunch of sinusoids that, there's creating some sound. And you want to either reduce certain sinusoids in there, partials, or you want to filter it, and to filter out that, meaning just like using the EQ and a low pass filter or a high pass filter to shape that sound in some way. One thing about that is that, that's a real basic understanding, because a lot of times that they're basically dealing with, basic waveforms like sawtooth or a pulse wave or a square wave to actually, to start out with in sculpting and attenuating certain aspects of it. So what does that mean? That basically most of the time when you're dealing with subtractive synthesis is that they're putting on either a low pass or a high pass filter or band pass filter to actually shape that sound. So basically you have that timbre and you're taking and you're putting a low pass filter on it, a high pass filter on it, or a band pass filter, the same way that you're doing with an EQ, that, you're adjusting, the low or high pass filter on it, to sculpt that sound some way with subtractive synthesis, starting out with a basic sound. So the basic concept of that is very simple. Normally, a lot of times you'll have a filter that has some basic, cut off, some basic filter, parameters of a, high pass filter, a low pass filter that have a slope that's set up for attenuation and a cutoff point, to where this point where it starts to go down, that's where the cutoff is set from. Some of these things like resonance is going to be, that cutoff point is going to get boosted. So that cutoff frequency is actually going to get, the resonance of that frequency is going to get boosted depending on which filter you use. Where it starts to slope off there, that's going to get, you're normally boosted with the resonance. Punch and drive aren't a normal aspect of subtractive synthesis, so we're not really going to deal with that. And taking it a step further, some programs, let's say something like Add Subtract FX, that you can get into some kind of synthesis that will actually go after harmonics, those partials directly inside of that actual, sound in that timbre, and allow you to actually attenuate those specific timbres inside of an actual timbre. That means that you would have like this sound here, and you'd be able to go in and specifically attenuate this sinusoid, this partial, or this partial here, this sinusoid here, and be able to attenuate it, reduce it with subtractive synthesis. And so basically that's a real basic understanding of it, that, that can get kind of complex in some applications. But basically it's just whatever you can, eliminate. It's a process of eliminating things to come to some sound that you're going to work with. And a lot of times subtractive synthesis will be, it works two ways. You might start out with some type of a sample that you do subtractive synthesis on it with filtering in a couple of different ways we talked about. And also you're going to use that at the next stage to do additive synthesis to add other things to it after you've done subtractive synthesis to some sound to build it some other way. And so that's a real key component in subtractive synthesis, that sometimes that can be very pertinent. And also that if you have like, a sawtooth wave or a triangle wave or a square wave that you're trying to reduce, you're trying to eliminate different parts or different partials or sinusoids from that to create a whole new sound. That, if you've watched that series on, just basic musical structures, you're trying to eliminate some of those intervals and some of those partials of that construct that makes the actual waveform, in an act of subtractive synthesis. So that's a real basic understanding of it. The idea of subtractive synthesis can get more complex, but that's the basic understanding of it. And, the best way to look at that is kind of how I was saying there, and also to keep in your mind that it may be, reducing any, aspect of the sound. That means you're trying to subtract different aspects of the sound, and it may not be those general aspects. It might be other aspects. You might be trying to get rid of other things that may be components of that sound, noise and distortion, all kinds of different things that might be in the actual sound. And if you watch those videos on sound, that, the things that are entailed in sound, that any of those things that you might, with the proper tools, be able to, subtract from the sound in the sculpting process. So subtractive synthesis is a fairly, easy to understand idea and concept. And if you look at it that way, that the concept's pretty easy to understand. Some of the tools when you get into the studio that, that those tools can be different. So, how you're subtracting and what tools they give you to subtract with can really vary. So if you're going to get into it, you really need to find, a tool, if you're working with sounds and you want to do subtractive synthesis, you really need to kind of look into that to see, how complex that you can afford, or the tools you're going to need to do subtractive synthesis from sounds. But it's a pretty basic concept, and that's most of the time what it entails. All right, additive synthesis. Here's another one. It's very simple. The basic concept of it is creating timbres by adding sine waves together. So, we understand that, when we have a timbre, we have one sinusoid. So, and we're going to add other sinusoids to it, other partials, to create a sound. So, that's a real basic concept to understand, is that if you watch the videos on harmonics, that you understand that you're adding harmonics or tones. They might not be harmonic tones, but other sinusoids to, a fundamental to actually create a timbre. So that's a real simple concept to understand. It's not difficult, or it's not complex in any way, shape, or form, the basic understanding of it. Partials and overtones, and like I said, you should have watched the video on harmonics, and you'd understand that, to understand what that means. But it's basically just adding sound, adding more sinusoids to the sound. So the basic concept of it is really simple, and if you keep it that simple in your mind, it is that simple, additive synthesis. So basically, you got an oscillator that's going to oscillate a sinusoid at a certain frequency, and then you're going to start adding more and more and more of them together to create timbres, all right, and sounds. So, the other aspect of that can be, you might start out with a sawtooth wave, or a triangle wave, or a square wave, and start doing additive synthesis from that. So, that concept, try to keep it that simple in your mind, that you're just trying to add things together, whatever you might have to work with. And in samplers, sometimes that you basically got a sound that you're working with, then you start adding to that, adding whatever you want to that. And it's that simple. We'll get into the parameters, some of the parameters of what things are doing in the synthesizer, but the basic concept is that simple. The primary concept is adding sinusoids together to build timbres, but that can grow up to the point of where you have a sampled sound that you're adding more to that. And that concept is real simple, because basically all the parameters that we may talk about, that you're adding and subtracting those parameters. So, when we talk about additive and subtractive synthesis, all the things that are happening on the synthesizer, if it's adding something to that sound, it's additive synthesis. If it's subtracting something, it's subtractive synthesis. And the other aspect of that that's not really addressed in either one of those two areas is, change synthesis, which basically means that any change you make, that you start, you're not actually adding something to it. ADSR is a real prime example of that. That, it's not really exactly additive synthesis or subtractive synthesis. You are actually changing the sound. So, there's no word that I know of that's change synthesis, but, it basically is, because those kind of things are definitely going to change it. Low frequency oscillators, that could be looked at as additive synthesis, but it's not the basic concept of additive synthesis. But, you can look at it that way, or you're actually changing the waveforms or changing what they're doing over time. But we'll get into that. So the basic concept of additive synthesis is really simple, of just adding, you're adding sinusoids to create timbres. And it's that simple, and, or adding sinusoids to a preset waveform, like a square wave or any type of wave like that. So see you in the next video.